The morning the sea turned black with sails, I was gathering wild berries near the edge of the forest, unaware that the world I knew was about to be devoured. The year was 879 AD, the season of cold mist and long nights, when the sea foam lingered like ghosts upon the rocks of Lindisford. I remember the sky, bruised and heavy, the cries of gulls breaking across the wind as if warning us of what was to come. My name was Eira, daughter of a fisherman and healer, a girl who had never left her coastal village in northern England, who believed the gods of the sea were kind if you prayed with enough sincerity. But that morning, the horizon filled with dragon-headed ships, their sails blood-red, and the gods answered with silence. The first horn echoed through the valley like the scream of a dying beast. Children froze mid-play, women dropped baskets of herbs, and the men, our fathers and brothers, ran for the weapons that could never match the fury coming for us. I remember my mother's hand clutching mine so hard her nails drew blood, and how the air began to taste of ash before the first arrow even struck. The Vikings came not as men, but as a storm. They moved with terrifying precision, their shields gleaming like serpents, axes raised high, their battle cries ancient and inhuman. I saw my father fall before he reached the door. I saw my brother try to fight and vanish beneath a red tide of steel. I screamed until my throat was raw, but the wind stole my voice. They burned the huts, they smashed the icons of our small chapel, and in the midst of that carnage, they gathered the survivors, women, mostly, binding our wrists with coarse rope. Their leader, a tall man with hair the color of iron and eyes pale as winter, looked over us not with rage but with hunger. His name, I would later learn, was Bjorn Hrafnsson, known among his men as the Crow of the North, a raider feared from the Irish coast to the Frankish ports. That day he pointed at me and two others, said something in his guttural tongue, and we were dragged toward the ships. Behind us, the village burned. The air was thick with smoke and screams. And I, who had never seen death before, walked barefoot through the ashes of my own home. We were forced onto the longships, thrown like spoils beside barrels of silver and sacks of grain. The sea wind was cold, merciless, cutting through my thin dress like knives. I tried to speak to the other women, but every word came out broken. One was a nun from a monastery nearby, another was barely 12. The men laughed as we huddled together. They spoke of us as if we were livestock, trading jokes about who would take whom when they reached home. I wanted to die, but death would have been mercy, and mercy was not something the Northmen carried with them. Days passed, perhaps weeks. Time was meaningless beneath that endless gray sky. They fed us only enough to keep us alive. At night, when the stars appeared, I would whisper prayers to a god who seemed deaf, and in those moments of silence, I realized that I had become something else. Not a daughter, not a woman, but a piece of property drifting toward an unknown fate. When we reached their homeland, the air smelled of pine and salt, and the land rose like a jagged wound from the sea. The fjords were dark and deep, cliffs dotted with wooden halls and smoke rising from hearths. It might have been beautiful if it weren't the landscape of my captivity. They dragged us through mud and snow to a settlement called Hrafnheim, where Bjorn ruled like a wolf among men. The villagers came out to stare at us, their faces hard and indifferent. Some spat, some laughed. I remember thinking that even the women here looked like they had survived a lifetime of winters carved in bone. We were taken to a longhouse, where the smell of roasted meat mixed with the stench of sweat and ale. One by one, the slaves were divided, some to serve, some to be sold, and others to satisfy darker appetites. When Bjorn looked at me, I felt his gaze not as lust, but as curiosity, like a man examining a weapon he did not yet know how to use. He said something in Norse, and I was pulled aside, kept apart from the others. Later that night, when the torches burned low, he came to me. He did not strike me, nor did he touch me, not then. Instead, he sat across the fire and asked, through a translator, my name. When I answered, he repeated it softly, as though tasting it. Eira, he said, means mercy in your tongue, yes? I nodded. There is no mercy in the north, he said. Remember that. Then he left. I did not understand why he spared me that night, nor why he ordered that I be clothed and given food when others were beaten or worse. Perhaps he saw something in me, fear, defiance, or simply amusement. Whatever it was, it saved my life, though I wasn't sure if survival was a blessing or a curse. Days turned into weeks. I learned fragments of their language, enough to follow orders, enough to hear their laughter. I cleaned their hall. I fetched water from the frozen stream, and each night I dreamed of fire and blood. Sometimes, in those dreams, I saw my mother's hand still reaching for me through the smoke. Winter arrived with the sound of howling wolves and snow that fell like endless ash. The settlement became a prison of ice. Hunger crept into the bones of even the strong men, and sickness claimed many of the slaves. Bjorn left for raids often, and when he returned, he brought with him more captives, more spoils, more ghosts. I began to notice something in him, though, a shadow that grew each time he returned. One night, after a feast, he came to me again, drunk and hollow-eyed. He told me, in his broken English, that he once had a daughter, small and fair-haired, who died when a Saxon village burned in revenge for one of his raids. "I have killed many," he said, "but the gods take what they wish." His voice trembled, and for a moment, I saw not a monster but a man drowning in his own sins. Then he looked at me and said, "You hate me. You should, but you will live." That night he did not touch me, yet I could feel his guilt pressing against me like a second skin. It was then I understood. Even the fiercest raiders are haunted by the things they destroy. Months passed. I became something between a servant and a shadow. The other slaves whispered that I had bewitched Bjorn, that he could not kill me because the gods cursed him if he did. I said nothing. I spent my days gathering herbs, helping an old woman who tended to the wounded. In that work, I found a strange purpose again. Once, I tended to a boy wounded in a raid, his chest split open by a sword. As I sewed the wound, his mother wept and whispered, "Eira," as if praying. For the first time since my capture, I realized that even in this land of ice, mercy could survive in small, fragile ways. But mercy did not last. One morning, as spring broke the snow, ships appeared again on the horizon, this time flying foreign banners. A retaliatory fleet from the south had come, Saxons bent on vengeance. The village erupted in chaos. The men armed themselves, women fled with children, and Bjorn stood at the head of his warriors, ready to defend what he had stolen. Amid the confusion, the old woman I served pressed a knife into my hand. "Run," she said in Norse. "The gods have taken enough." But I did not run. Something stronger than fear rooted me there. The need to see the fire end, to close the circle that began the day my own home burned. The battle that followed was a storm of blood and steel. From the hills, I watched the longhouse burn as our village once had. I saw Bjorn cut down men twice his size, roaring like a beast. I saw arrows pierce his armor, and still he fought. When the smoke cleared, the Saxons had retreated, leaving behind corpses and ruins. Bjorn lay dying near the shore, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the gray sky. I approached him, trembling, the knife still in my hand. He looked at me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, in a hoarse whisper, "Mercy," his final word. I dropped the knife. I closed his eyes, and I wept, not for him, but for all the worlds consumed by fire. That night, I stood at the edge of the fjord, the wind howling through the cliffs. The settlement was gone. The people scattered. I had no home to return to, no family left. But I was alive, and in that fragile heartbeat between loss and freedom, I made a vow, not to forget, not to forgive, but to carry the memory of every woman who had burned, every child taken by the sea. The gods, I decided, were neither kind nor cruel. They were silent, and silence was the only truth left. I turned toward the forest, toward the unknown, the frost biting my skin, the stars cold above. Behind me, the ashes of two worlds drifted together in the wind. And thus began my second life, not as a captive, not as a victim, but as a ghost walking through the ruins of history, seeking the meaning of mercy in a world that had forgotten what it was. The winter deepened over the northern fjords like a beast drawing breath, and in its cold lungs, Eira's fate was suspended between the world of the free and the world of the enslaved. The snow came early that year, thick and relentless, coating the wooden roofs of Bjorn's settlement and silencing the sea with a crust of ice. Inside the longhouse, the fire burned night and day, but no flame could thaw the frost in Eira's heart. She had been in captivity for 3 moons now, and though her wounds had healed, her soul remained raw and open, every scar of her village's destruction branded into her dreams. She slept on a straw mat near the back wall with the other captives, their breaths forming a pale mist above them in the cold air, and when the men laughed around the fire, the women lay silent, their eyes reflecting the flicker of flame like ghosts who remembered another life. Bjorn the Crow, her captor, was a man divided. He carried himself with the pride of a conqueror, yet his eyes betrayed something else, a sickness that neither mead nor victory could cure. Sometimes, he would watch Eira as if seeing in her a mirror of everything he had lost or destroyed. Once, she had caught him standing near her as she tended to a wounded child in the healer's hut, his expression unreadable, his hand tightening around the hilt of his axe, as if battling an unseen demon. Eira, sensing his gaze, refused to bow her head. Her defiance was the last piece of freedom she still owned. "You are not my god," she whispered once, when he drew near, and for a moment, she saw his jaw tighten, not in anger, but in shame. Days turned into weeks, and Eira's life among the Vikings began to twist into something she could neither escape nor fully despise. The healer, an old woman named Astrid, taught her the herbs of the northern forests, the frostweed that soothed burns, the snowberry that stilled pain, the black moss that could kill a fever or a man, depending on the will of the one who used it. Through these lessons, Eira began to find a strange rhythm in her captivity, a purpose that masked her hatred with the quiet dignity of survival. The other captives looked to her now. She had a strength they did not, a steadiness that even the Norse warriors began to notice. When Bjorn fell ill during the great midwinter feast, struck by fever after a raid in the mountains, it was Eira whom Astrid sent to tend him. She entered his private chamber reluctantly, carrying a bowl of bitter herbs, her hands steady though her heart raced like a drum. The sight of him startled her. This man who had once appeared unbreakable now lay drenched in sweat, his strength reduced to tremors. His breath came shallow, his lips cracked with fever, and for a long while he said nothing, only stared at her as if he could not believe she was real. "You should have let me die," he murmured finally, his voice hoarse. "Death is too kind for men like me." Eira hesitated, then dipped the cloth into the bowl and pressed it against his forehead. "Kindness is not for you," she said coldly, "but justice is." He closed his eyes, and for 3 nights she nursed him, refusing to speak more than necessary, until the fever broke and his color returned. When he awoke fully, he found her asleep by the fire, her head resting against the wall, her hands still stained with herbs. For the first time in his life, Bjorn the Crow felt something he could not conquer: remorse. The thaw came slowly that year, the ice cracking along the fjord with the groan of an old god awakening, and with it came the whispers of rebellion. Among the slaves, and even some of the younger warriors, the talk was that Bjorn had grown soft, that his sickness had cursed his spirit. One night, a rival chieftain named Hakon came to the settlement with 20 men, bearing gifts and wine, but his smiles were poisoned with ambition. Eira watched from the shadows as the 2 men greeted one another, the tension between them thick as smoke. Hakon's eyes lingered too long on her, his grin sharp as a blade. "So this is the witch who healed the crow," he said mockingly. Perhaps she cast more than herbs into his blood. Bjorn's expression hardened, and before Eira could move, he struck Hakon across the face with the back of his hand. The hall erupted in shouts, swords half drawn, but Bjorn's voice silenced them all. "Touch her, and I will burn your ships myself." That night, the air between them changed forever. Eira could no longer tell whether Bjorn was her protector or her jailer. The line between mercy and possession blurred until it became one and the same. She feared him, yet there was something in his eyes, a hollow grief, a yearning for forgiveness, that mirrored her own despair. As spring approached, Bjorn ordered the slaves to rebuild a small outpost near the river mouth, and to her surprise, he chose Eira to oversee the herbal supplies. She worked from dawn until dusk, often in silence, surrounded by the endless sigh of the forest. Sometimes she would pause by the river, watching the ice drift away, and imagine her home beyond the horizon. But one afternoon, while gathering roots near the edge of the woods, she stumbled upon something that stopped her breath: the remains of a small wooden cross, half buried in snow. It was carved with the same pattern her brother had once made for her, the mark of their family. Tears stung her eyes as she knelt, clutching the rotted wood to her chest. Someone had survived. Someone from her village had come this far north. That night, she could not sleep. Every creak of the longhouse seemed to whisper her brother's name. Days later, a messenger arrived from the coast. A band of captured Northmen had been attacked by an English warship near Lindisford. Among them was said to be a slave woman who spoke of a girl named Eira taken by the crow. Hope surged through her veins like fire. Her brother was alive. She could feel it. And with that hope came a new resolve. She would escape. Not tonight. Not yet, but soon. Her chance came when Bjorn and his men rode south to settle a dispute with Håkon. The settlement was left in the care of a few old warriors and Astrid. That night, Eira gathered what little she had: a knife, a cloak, and the wooden cross. She whispered a silent farewell to Astrid, who, with weary eyes, only nodded. "The gods favor the brave," the old woman said softly. "Go, before the wind changes." Eira slipped into the darkness, her footsteps muffled by snow, the cold biting her skin like knives. She followed the river north, the moon her only companion. For 2 nights, she traveled without rest, surviving on melted snow and frozen berries, until she reached the edge of the forest where the mountains met the sea. There, at dawn, she saw it. A small camp by the shore, the tattered remnants of an English banner fluttering weakly in the wind. Her heart leapt, but as she approached, a figure stepped from behind the rocks. It was Bjorn. He was pale, his beard heavy with frost, his eyes hollow but burning. "You thought you could run," he said quietly. "I told Astrid to watch you, and she did. But I came myself." Eira's hand went to her knife, though she knew it was useless. "You'll have to kill me first," she hissed. He shook his head slowly. "No, Eira. I came to let you go." She froze. "Why?" she demanded. Bjorn's gaze fell to the cross in her hand. "Because I have killed enough ghosts. You should not be one of them." For a moment, neither spoke, the only sound the wind moaning across the ice. Then, without another word, he stepped aside. Eira stared at him, her breath trembling, then turned and ran toward the shore. Behind her, she heard him whisper something, perhaps a blessing, perhaps a farewell, and when she looked back once, he was gone, swallowed by the snow. Eira found the English survivors 3 days later, a handful of broken men and women clinging to life near the coast. Among them, half-starved but alive, was her brother Leif. They embraced in silence, tears freezing on their cheeks, their hearts bound by all that had been lost. For weeks they hid among the rocks, living on fish and prayer, until at last, an English ship passing north spotted their signal fire and took them aboard. As the coastline of Norway faded behind her, Eira stood at the stern, clutching the cross, and thought of Bjorn, the monster who had destroyed her world and yet, in the end, had set her free. She wondered if he had done it for redemption or for love, and whether it even mattered. The sea stretched endless before her, a mirror of everything she had endured. She had survived hell, and in surviving, she had become something more than a victim. She had become legend. But legends, she knew, were never finished. For somewhere, far across the frozen north, the ravens still flew, and among them, perhaps, flew the soul of the crow himself. Years had passed since the ice melted away from the northern fjords. The sea was still cold, but now it carried a silence that only time can create. Eira was no longer the captive girl who once knelt in Bjorn's longhouse. The years had carved lines on her face, but those lines were not of weakness. They were the marks of survival, of fire tempered into steel. In the southern lands of England, where a new fortress had risen by the cliffs, Eira had become known as a healer, a teacher, and a protector. The villagers called her the Woman of Ice, for her heart, they said, was like the northern snow, cold, strong, and pure. But at night, when the waves crashed against the rocks, she still heard a name whispering in the wind: Bjorn. One winter morning, a messenger arrived at her fortress, drenched in seawater, trembling with fear. He brought news from the north. A new Viking warlord had risen beyond the frozen sea, calling himself the Crow's heir. He claimed to be the son of Bjorn the Crow, and he had sworn vengeance against England for his father's humiliation. Eira's blood ran cold. The son of Bjorn alive? In that moment, The memories of her captivity returned like a storm. The burning village, the chains, the long winter nights, and that final moment when Bjorn had let her go. Fate, it seemed, had drawn its circle complete. She knew what she had to do. If I don't stop this, she whispered to herself, then all that suffering was for nothing. She called her brother Leif, now a soldier in the English ranks. This war is not the war of kings, Leif, she said, her eyes steady as the sea. This is the war of our souls. He nodded solemnly. Then we return to the north? Eira looked toward the horizon. Yes, but this time we do not go as slaves. We go as justice. Weeks later, they sailed across the same waters that had once carried her in chains. But this time, the wind was behind her, not against her. She rode at the head of a small English force, armored in black leather, cloak whipping in the northern wind, Bjorn's old dagger at her side. The same dagger that had once threatened her life now gleamed as her symbol of defiance. When their ships reached the northern shore, the air was thick with smoke. A Viking settlement was burning. But this was not the same village she remembered. Its banners were new, its people younger, and its throne occupied by another. Upon that throne sat a man with long golden hair and eyes cold as steel, the image of Bjorn, yet sharper, crueler. "Who are you?" Eira demanded. "I am Esker," he said, rising with a cruel smile, "son of Bjorn the Crow. You are the woman who weakened my father, the reason he died in shame." Eira drew her sword. "I did not weaken him," she said, her voice steady. "I gave him back his soul." The battle erupted like thunder. Steel clashed over snow. The cries of men and the roar of fire filled the fjord. Eira fought like one possessed. Every swing of her blade was a memory. Every wound she dealt a prayer for those who had died long ago. Esker fought with the fury of youth, but Eira's will was stronger than rage. When he lunged, she caught him off guard and drove Bjorn's dagger into his chest. He fell to his knees, gasping, his blood staining the snow. "My father spared you," he hissed. "But I will not." Eira leaned close, her eyes burning. "You never knew your father. He spared me because he remembered what it meant to be human. You, Esker, never will." When it was over, the village lay silent under the falling snow. Eira stood before the old throne, the same carved seat where Bjorn once sat, and slowly raised the wooden cross that still hung around her neck. She looked up at the gray sky. "Bjorn," she whispered, "if you can hear me, know this. I did not come to avenge you. I came to finish your repentance." The clouds broke, and snow began to drift softly from the heavens, like ashes of peace. Leif approached her quietly. "What will you do now, sister?" Eira looked toward the endless sea. "I'll go where peace lives, maybe across the ocean, maybe beyond life itself." That night, while others slept, Eira walked alone to the shore. The sea was calm, dark, and waiting. She knelt, buried Bjorn's dagger in the sand, and pressed the wooden cross against her heart. "There is only one difference between life and death," she said softly. "Memory. And I want mine to be as pure as snow." Then she stepped into the sea. The water rose around her knees, her waist, her chest, but she never turned back. Overhead, a single raven circled the moon, crying once before vanishing into the storm. By morning, the waves had washed away her footprints. All that remained on the shore was the dagger, the cross, and the whisper of the tide. The villagers said, "The woman of ice became the queen of the sea." And so, Eira's story did not end. It transformed into legend, a tale whispered by northern winds and carried by the wings of ravens. They say that when a lone raven flies across the snow, it is not the spirit of Bjorn the Crow. It is Eira herself, watching over all who mistake cruelty